Hey guys, so I was reminiscing about video cards the other day and decided to pull some of my oldies but goodies out of storage and kind of do a video for you guys and show you what I have. This is by no means all of the video cards that I have owned, but just what I currently own at this time. So let's go ahead and just take a look. All right, the first card we'll be looking at today is the ATI Radeon X850 XT. This card was launched back in December of 2004 and was based off of the 130 nanometer R480 GPU. The 850 XT had a 256-bit memory interface and a total of 256 megabytes of GDDR3. Now this was a dual slot cooler, which was different from the X800 series. It also used a single 6-pin PCI Express connector and had a total TDP of 69 watts. As far as video out is concerned, most X850 XT cards had dual DVI connectors and a single S-video out. This particular model has a single VGA, a single DVI, along with an S-video out. The X50 XT wasn't a huge departure from the original X800 XT that was released back in May of 2004. Notably, the biggest difference was the added support for DirectX 9.0B and the higher memory and higher core clock speeds as well. It was usually enough to meet or exceed the performance of NVIDIA's high-end 6800 Ultra. The second card is the NVIDIA GeForce 7800 GTX. This high-end graphics card was launched back in June 2005 for a launch price of $599. The 7800 GTX was based on a 110 nanometer G70 GPU. The GTX came packed with a 256-bit memory interface as well as 256 megabytes of video memory. The GTX came equipped with a single 6-pin PEG connector and had a TDP of 86 watts. The 7800 GTX also had dual DVI outputs along with a single S-video out. The quiet single slot cooler of the 7800 GTX was quite the departure from its predecessor, the noisier 2-slot 6800 Ultra. The GTX provided a very nice boost in performance over the older 6800 Ultra and ATI's X850 XT Platinum Edition. It was crowned the single fastest GPU when it was released. A variant of the chip was later used in the PlayStation 3's RSX chip. Next up is the NVIDIA GeForce 7950 GX2. The 7950 GX2 was the first consumer NVIDIA card to make use of multiple GPUs in a single slot. For the first time, consumers also had the option to go quad SLI. The GX2 was launched back in June of 2006 for a price of $599. This was also based off of two 90 nanometer G71 GPUs. The GX2 had a 256-bit memory interface and 512 megabytes of GDDR3 per GPU. The GX2 also had a single 6-pin PEG connector for a total TDP of 110 watts. For video out, we're looking at dual DVI outputs along with a single S-video out. This is also in a dual slot form factor. As far as performance goes, the GX2 was an absolute beast for its time. In fact, there wasn't another single card that could even come close to it in performance. Essentially, the 7950 GX2 was two 7900 GTs in SLI, but at higher clock speeds, which routinely led to the GX2 being faster than two 79 GTs in SLI. Next up is one of my personal favorites, the GeForce 8800 GTX. The 8800 GTX was the first NVIDIA card to introduce a unified architecture. This change introduced stream processors, which would later be called CUDA cores. The 8800 GTX was launched in November of 2006 with a launch price of $599. The G80 GPU was also built on a 90 nanometer process. The GTX came equipped with a 384-bit memory interface, 768 megabytes of GDDR3 memory, and 128 stream processors. The 8800 GTX also had dual 6-pin PEG connectors and a total TDP of 155 watts. Dual DVI and a single S-video handled the video output. The GTX was also launched with a beefy dual-slot rear exhaust cooler. This was used to help cope with the higher TDP versus its predecessor. Performance improvements over the previous generation, in some cases, were downright nuts. In certain games, the 8800 GTX would surpass the performance of a 7900 series in SLI and ATI's X1950 in Crossfire. This was hands down the fastest GPU to be ever released, and it would keep that title for some time. This next card was born from a true game changer. This is the 9800 GT, and in essence, it's the same card as the 8800 GT that came before it. The 9800 GT was launched in July of 2008 with a price tag of $160. The 98 GT came equipped with a refined 65nm G92 GPU. The GT featured a 256 memory interface, 512 MB of GDDR3, and 112 stream processors. The 98 GT came with a single 6-pin PEG connector and had a total TDP of 125 watts. Like most of the other cards, video out was handled by dual DVI connectors along with a single S-video. Later in its life, the 9800 GT transitioned into a 55nm part. This change didn't bring any performance increase, but it was thought to bring slightly lower power consumption. Performance was identical to the 8800 GT that came before it. I had mentioned the 8800 GT was a game changer, and the reason for that was because it brought 8800 GTX levels of performance down to a price point that most gamers could appreciate, making the 8800 GT and the 9800 GT a truly great card. This next card was a beast for its day, the GeForce 9800 GX2. The GX2 was NVIDIA's second single-slot dual GPU flagship. The GX2 was released in March of 2008 with a launch price of $599. This dual G92 GPU beast was essentially two 8800 GTS 512 MB editions in a single card. The 9800 GX2 had a 256-bit memory interface, 512 MB of GDDR3 per GPU, and 128 stream processors per GPU. The GX2 required a 6 and 8-pin PEG connector and had a max TDP of 197 watts. Video out was handled by dual DVI ports along with a single HDMI out. Performance was to be expected for a card of this class. The GX2 handily beat the 8800 GTX and the 8800 Ultra, along with ATI's dual GPU flagship, the Radeon 3870 X2. The downside of the 9800 GX2 was its higher power consumption and high load temperatures. Regardless, this was still the fastest GPU of its time. This next card had a GPU that's been used time and time again. This is the GeForce GTS 250. The GTS 250 was released in March of 2009 for a launch price of $199. The GTS 250 used the latest revision of the G92 GPU, the 55nm G92B. This 128 stream processor G92 GPU was also used in the 8800 GTS 512, the 9800 GTX, while the B revision was used in the 9800 GTX Plus and the GTS 250. The GTS 250 came equipped with a 256-bit memory interface, 1 GB of GDDR3 memory, and 128 stream processors. Power was handled by a single 6-pin PEG connector, and the card had a max TDP of 150 watts. Video out was handled by dual DVI outputs along with a single S-video. This PNY model had a custom 2-slot open air cooler, but it did maintain the stock frequencies as the reference card. The GTS 250 was the fastest G92B model to be released. It was able to beat out the now older 8800 GTX and ATI's newer Radeon 4850. The G92 GPU had a good run, but it was now reaching the end of the line. Our next card is the AMD Radeon XT 7790. This mid-range video card was launched back in March 2013 at a price of $149. The HD 7790 was based off of AMD's 28nm Bonaire GPU. The 7790 came equipped with a 128-bit memory interface, 1GB of GDDR5, and 896 stream processors. For the power, the 7790 only required a single 6-pin PEG connector and had a max TDP of 85 watts. This variant of the card is the Sapphire OC edition, which had a 75 MHz factory overclock on the core and a 40 MHz overclock on the memory. Video out was handled by dual DVI ports along with a single HDMI and DisplayPort. Performance for a mid-range card was relatively good. It fell right in the middle of this HD 7850 and the previous generation HD 6870. The Sapphire overclock variant could even come close to the 7850 in some titles. Next up is the Radeon HD 7970 GHz edition. This beast of a card was released in June 2012 with a launch price of $499. The GHz edition was based off of AMD's 28nm Tahiti GPU. The card featured a 384-bit memory interface, 3GB of GDDR5, and 2048 stream processors. The GHz edition required a 6-pin and 8-pin PEG connector and had a TDP of over 250 watts. Video out is handled by a single DVI and a single HDMI, as well as dual mini DisplayPorts. The 7970 GHz was AMD's response to NVIDIA's GTX 680. Performance was very good, and in some titles the GHz edition beat the GTX 680. Eventually, due to driver improvements, the 7970 GHz actually ended up beating the GTX 680. And to this day, with continued driver improvements and AMD's console wins, the 7970 GHz actually holds up much better than the GTX 680, and even in some cases comes close to the 780. And now to the last card of our roundup, the GeForce GTX 780. The GTX 780 was released May of 2013 with a launch price of $649. The GTX 780 used a 28nm GK110 GPU. The 780 featured a 384-bit memory interface, 3GB of GDDR5 memory, and 2304 CUDA cores. The reference GTX 780 used a 6 and 8-pin PEG connector, while the Lightning edition shown here uses two 8-pin PEG connectors. TDP was set to 250 watts. Video out was handled by dual DVIs and a single HDMI and DisplayPort. The Lightning edition came with an impressive 16+2+1 phase design and came out of the box with an impressive factory overclock. Performance was a bit better than a reference GTX 780, and it came closer to the GTX 780 Ti. The Kepler architecture hasn't aged particularly well. The Lightning edition still holds its own to today. And that's it, everyone. These are all the video cards that I currently own. As I said, I've owned many more of them, but I have sold them to help fund the next upgrade. I will say my top two favorite ATI/AMD cards would be the Radeon 9500 Pro and the Radeon HD 4890. My top two NVIDIA cards I would have to say would be the 8800 GTX and my GTX 780 Lightning. I would probably say my number one favorite video card that I have owned has been the 8800 GTX. Man, I love that card. Anyways, guys, thanks for checking out the video.